Hey guys, well, thank you so much for joining us today to learn a little bit more about the JDAI or Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. My name is Brittany Neal. I am the state JDAI administrator with the Ohio Department of Youth Services. I'm here with my colleague Cecilia Coe, and we're excited to share a little bit about one of the nationally recognized juvenile justice reform initiatives that Ohio is taking part in and has been working to implement throughout almost close to 2 decades or so throughout several jurisdictions around the state of Ohio. So I'm going to share my screen. Feel free as we are going along to add maybe a couple comments or questions in the chat if you have any. Also, if you wouldn't mind, we're okay with everyone, remaining off camera if that's what you are more comfortable with. But if you are comfortable with turning your cameras on, it would be great to see your faces. In the meantime, though, as we are kind of getting started, if everyone wouldn't mind just saying their name and what agency or organization they're with, and maybe their role, and putting that in the chat function or the chat feature of the call today so that we can get just a good idea of who's in the room with us. So I'm going to share my screen and then turn it over to my colleague, Cecilia, who will lead us in the first portion of our presentation.
All right, awesome.
1 second, let me put this in for the center mode. I need to hide. Sorry guys, I'm going to hide this really quickly. All righty. Are you guys getting sound for every time someone comes into the room?
No.
Okay, that
No.
doesn't work for you guys? Okay, perfect.
Awesome. So like Brittany said, I am Cecilia Coe. I am the state JDAI analyst with the Department of Youth Services. And we'll kind of go into a little bit about what the Juvenile Detention Alternatives or JDAI really is. So for folks who don't know, it is a juvenile justice system reform process that enables jurisdictions to safely reduce their reliance on detention, and instead really establishing more effective and efficient systems to, while still maintaining the goals of, public safety and creating just more equitable systems and processes for our young people. This actually started as a pilot project in 1993 across 5 different sites across the country. It started with Seattle, Washington, Sacramento, California, Cook County, which is Chicago, Illinois, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and in New York City. And now it's actually one of the most widely replicated juvenile justice initiatives nationwide, and it's now spread across 250 jurisdictions across 39 states. And it started with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. It was founded by the foundation, which is a national philanthropic organization. It was founded by the founder of UPS to honor his late mother and really dedicating his life to serving and supporting youth and families, especially those populations who've historically been underserved. And the foundation really got its start in, I believe, child welfare, in the child welfare area, and it's really expanded its efforts in many other areas to help serve youth, and juvenile justice is just one of those areas, and JDAI falls into that. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah. And so why focus on detention reform? In kind of the 80s and 90s, there was the birth of the super predator myth, this fear or public perception that all juveniles were going to become, super predators or dangerous criminals, which really played, a role in that era of mass incarceration. And that in order to ensure the safety of community, we had to lock everyone up and anyone up, even though there was evidence and research to show that detention did not have positive impacts on public safety or recidivism. And so this over-reliance on detention, it really led to an increase in incarceration, overcrowded facilities, which was really unsafe for youth and staff. And it was really here that that was the driver and the start of JDAI. And detention reform really at this point was a good entry point for overall juvenile justice reform over time, of course. And from a taxpayer perspective too, detention was really expensive, still very much expensive. There was a recent study by the Justice Policy Institute in 2020. I guess I'll leave it up to the chat. Does anyone know how much it costs per day to house a youth in a detention facility, or the cost over a year? So it actually costs about $588 a day. So that's over $200,000 a year just to house one youth in a detention facility, which is really mind-blowing because you could send about 2 kids to college at OSU to finish their 4-year degree for that amount of money. And so really rethinking, how can jurisdictions utilize that funding and taxpayer money more effectively? Where can we invest in other parts of the system, in the front end of the system, in programming and other detention alternatives that can still really achieve those goals of detention, which really is public safety, and to also ensure that youth still have the chance to learn the skills that they need to become healthy adults and contribute to society as young adults. But even with that, and next slide, please, Brittany. Jurisdictions were still incarcerating young people, and part of the belief that all young people who were in detention were dangerous, but that was really far from the truth. There was a lot of research, and Ohio data also kind of mirrored this as well, that the youth in detention were all dangerous, but actually the majority of youth were in for nonviolent offenses, misdemeanor offenses, technical violations, and your status offenses, which were the offenses that were criminal just because of your behavior, like underage drinking, truancy, things of that nature. And only about a quarter were actually held for a violent person offense. And so when we're talking about detention reform, we're really talking about identifying who's the most appropriate for detention, who's actually posing a risk to public safety, and those who don't fall into that immediate category, what other avenues exist for them to still have maybe a level of supervision and accountability that doesn't require a setting that's as restrictive as detention, and that can have really negative impacts on our youth. Because at the end of the day, these young people are they're coming back into our communities, they're coming back to our homes, into our zip codes. So how can we ensure that we're maintaining that accountability piece while also providing them, again, the skills that they need to ensure that they maybe don't find themselves in that spot anymore, or just making those mistakes. And I think this is a big driver of the purpose of detention within the JDAI framework. There's 2, identified primary premises for detention. One, mainly if they pose a public safety risk to public safety, and then also just to if they pose a risk to not appearing for court. Next slide. But even with that information about detention, and even with some of that early JDAI work, the US still incarcerates more young people than a lot of other countries around the world. So we're really unique in that aspect. And I think that really speaks to how we as a country respond to sometimes just misbehavior and young people making mistakes. Because I'm sure we've all, made silly mistakes as a kid before. But we're really unique in that aspect in how we respond to, misbehavior in our incarceration of youth. Next slide, please. And because we know, based on a lot of research, that detention can have really significant impacts on young people. Even one night in detention can really disrupt ties to school, to family, to their community connections. And that can really have a detrimental impact on our young people. And those who are held in detention are more than 3 times as likely to be found guilty and incarcerated than those youth who were not incarcerated. and even after release, incarcerated youth are more likely to be have higher rates of using alcohol and drugs and dropping out of school. So this really has impacts that follow youth even after they've left detention. Next slide, please. And so really the premise of JDAI, right, we're not, it's not saying that we're eliminating the use of detention. There's still a time and a place for that. But really what it's all about is eliminating that inappropriate and unnecessary use of secure detention, really reducing that over-reliance on it. And so how can we use data as a way to guide our decision-making and help us establish practices and policies that are more efficient and effective? Because we want our youth in the justice system to all have those opportunities to develop into healthy adults. Next slide, please. And so the vision of JDAI, like I said, all youth who are in the justice system, we want them to have opportunities to develop into healthy adults. And so how can we establish different ways to still achieve those goals of protecting the community, having that public safety, and also making sure that our youth are still returning to court without using detention when it's not necessary. So how can we use our money in different ways? How can we utilize and improve different areas of our justice system that can better serve our youth who are not appropriate for detention? Like in the very front end with assessment centers, which we'll touch briefly on later, or detention or in probation. Can we invest in alternative programs, invest in our community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, so that young people can remain in their communities to maybe complete any needed programming or services, or just to seek support within their community without having to be so closely connected to the court system. And if detention is used with JDAI, also making sure that conditions are safe, clean, and healthy environments while being confined, and that they're also receiving those needed supports and resources in a timely manner. Next slide, please. And so this is a very important slide. I think Brittany and I will always say, if you don't take anything else from this presentation, definitely take away this slide. Because JDAI, it's not about eliminating detention. I think that's often a misconception or a myth about JDAI. When they hear detention alternatives, they think, releasing all of our youth from detention and getting rid of detention. It's not about that. It's, again, just about how can we eliminate that inappropriate use, that unnecessary use of detention, and making sure just the appropriate youth are, that detention is used appropriately. Again, that detention should be used for youth who pose a significant risk to public safety or pose a risk to not appearing for court. JDAI does not promote unaccountability of youth. We're definitely still looking to hold youth accountable, but in what ways is that more developmentally appropriate? Detention just isn't the way to hold youth accountable in a more meaningful way. JDAI also does not deter restorative justice or victim restitution. It's still very much about restoring the victim and making communities whole. And JDAI is not a program. The Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative is very much a philosophy or a framework that's really just meant to help jurisdictions guide and inform their work as a court and in their work in juvenile justice. So it's not a program or department that's kind of in their separate corner in the court system, and that only handles one part of a program or one part of the court system or just detention. It's about the whole system, and it really is a philosophy to guide all of our work. And again, JDAI is not just about detention. Definitely had its start and roots in detention reform, but you can't do that without also impacting other areas of the juvenile justice system. Next slide, please. And so this is the My Child principle. It's one of the guiding values of JDAI. And so we'll show a quick clip of this, but really it's about, if my child, I don't have a child, but if even if it was my like niece or nephew, brother, sister, whoever, if they were part of the system, are they being treated like I would want them to be treated within the system? And so we'll show a quick clip on what the My Child principle is.
There's always been in JDAI a sense that we don't want to treat the children in detention as quote unquote the other, that it's like the people running the facility are one kind of people and the kids that are in detention are another kind of people. And I think that the My Child standard fits very much with that, that we are caring people. That these children are not some kind of monster or some kind of being that needs to be treated differently from any child.
The My Child standard is a value and principle that as we work on developing policies and practices, it would be with the underlying the foundation for that change in the policy and practice would be, how would it impact my child? Would this be, if my child was involved in the youth justice system, is this how I would want my child to be treated within any continuum, not only conditions of confinement, but at any aspect of the continuum of the youth justice system?
I mean, this is an aspirational value, but one, I think, if you think about it soberly for a brief period of time, oughtn't be a stretch for us. Any of us who are adults, especially those of us who are parents or come from families with children, should readily be able to accept the notion that public systems that are supposed to be responding to the challenges that our children pose would want those systems to meet a standard that we would set for our own kids, rather than sort of considering the kids as somehow different or other and unworthy of the same opportunities, the same services, the same advantages that we would want to see for our own children.
So for me, the real My Child test is that when it's our own kids, when it's someone who we really care about, we always see their potential. We're always thinking about their future. We're not just thinking about next week. I see this future for my own kid, and it never is one that I think about including a secure detention center, a correctional facility, being put on probation, any of those things. But if they were, I as a parent would still see that my kid has a limitless future, right? I would still expect that what he can become doesn't change just because he's gotten involved in the juvenile justice system. And I think the real difference, I think the real My Child test that I'd like to apply when it comes to juvenile justice systems, and the thing that's probably changed for me the most from having kids, is that the way that we look at the young people who come into the juvenile justice system? Do we see the 14-year-old who comes in and's been arrested for breaking into a home or for stealing a car? Do we see this as a young person who has potential? Do we see this as a young person who deserves to have their hopes and dreams fulfilled? Do we see this as a young person who's going to graduate from high school and go to college? So it's not enough. The point of all this is to say it's not enough when we talk about the My Child test. It's not enough just to say, is the way we detain kids today good enough if it was for my kids? It's that we wouldn't even just be thinking about today. If it was for our kids, we're thinking about the future in a way that we need to start doing for the young people in the juvenile justice system much, much more.
So the My Child principle is very foundational. It's like a principle to, a lot of the juvenile justice practice and work that we do, and especially among and within our 8 core strategies of JDAI. And it's just, again, it's like embedded in all of those strategies. And so within the 8 core strategies, JDAI has identified collaboration. Collaboration is a huge player in JDAI work. Effective and sustainable change really can't happen without partners in every area of the court system, from line staff, probation officers, detention staff, to leaders, court administrators, supervisors, and our judges. But most importantly, I think the real impact to really do this work in collaboration, it can't happen without bringing community, family, and youth to the table. And not just to fill a seat at the table, but to really be the experts in ensuring, we're serving our youth most equitably. Community stakeholders, partners, family, youth, voice, they should really be empowered to be the drivers of influence and contributors to our practice and policy. Our next strategy is also use of data to make those data-driven decisions. The system reform really means identifying those opportunities for change and continuous improvement. Sites use data to kind of objectively recognize areas of opportunity and to help them drive their solutions. So, for example, for Ohio, we also collect their local detention data called the QRS. And so, for example, if I'm looking through their detention data for the quarter and I see like their admissions under like a misdemeanors persons, I might use that. I might ask questions and checking in with our JDAI sites to be like, hey, what are these numbers? And they might tell me it might be an influx in some domestic violence youth being admitted to detention. And so from there, that can really guide our discussions on what opportunities exist to serve these youth differently, where there are opportunities to ensure that, all other family members or trusted neighbors could have taken in this youth to serve as a respite before really utilizing detention. So that's just an example of using data. The next core strategy is objective admissions criteria to detention. Again, detention admissions and policies and practices have to distinguish between youth who are most likely to be a risk to public safety and those who are likely to not reappear for court. And you can't really do that without also having appropriate alternatives to detention. And this really helps to increase those options for arrested youth to, again, provide another level of supervision and structure and accountability that where detention just isn't appropriate. Case processing reform. So this can look like strategies to help reduce the length of stay in detention or in custody, or just the length of time from the case being open to the case being closed. How can we ensure that interventions for youth, youth are being served in a timely manner? Or those youth who are maybe are not appropriate for detention, are they being linked to any supports, resources, and services kind of in between that time that they're first initially in contact with the court, between maybe their adjudication and disposition? Special detention cases, this could include things, youth who are admitted to detention for things like a technical violation or probation violation. So if we see kind of an influx in that, what kind of thinking outside the box, what other opportunities exist for maybe probation officers? Do they have a graduated sanctions grid, or do they have the skills or resources to respond to youth behavior differently? That's still concise, it's still fair, but also in line with maybe their risk level. Reducing racial disparities. We know that youth of color, specifically Black and brown youth, and in Ohio are Black boys, they're overrepresented at every stage of the juvenile justice system. And kind of even as you get deeper into the system, that disparity really increases. And so this work in JDAI really can't be done without always leading with race and using an REI lens. And so our responses need to be, culturally informed. Our programming or how we engage in community must be done through that race equity lens, leading with race. And even things like our screening and assessment tools, that also has to be considered. So everything we do in JDAI work, we have to lead with race. And lastly, conditions of confinement, really emphasizing the importance of having safe and humane environments for our youth in detention. And so these are 8 core strategies within JDAI. They're all very much interrelated. You can't really do one without the other, or one without 2 or 3 more strategies. For example, something that we've recently done within our state leadership, or with our JDAI state leadership in Ohio, we kind of talked about some of our firearm data. So using that data to help inform, will also drive conversation, but also help them drive decision-making within their court. But that can't be done without collaborating with our leadership, with their court leadership, and also leading with race, because it was identified that our Black boys, specifically around the age of 16, they're overrepresented in that data set for youth who are being admitted to detention for a firearm-related offense. And so how can we also adopt different types of alternatives to detention that are also being led with the race equity lens? So just kind of an example of how all of those play into each other. And you're most likely doing like multiple, like 3 or 4 strategies at once. Next slide, please. And then this is just a video, again, kind of talking more about the values and vision of JDAI, and that it's more than just detention, and kind of the vision of what JDAI could be in the future.
What are those values that join us together as a network and animate our work together? I think about it this way. We are a network committed to ensuring that every child, every day, experience a youth justice system that is just, in the sense that it is committed to racial and ethnic equity and fairness to girls and LGBTQ youth, that it's developmentally appropriate, in the sense that the system seeks to divert as many young people as possible, transform probation, minimize confinement, and when young people are confined, ensure that facilities are safe, dignifying, healing, and well-designed to help young people grow and mature. That we're accountable, in the sense that from police to courts to probation to corrections agencies, we grown-ups are accountable to the young people, families, and communities we serve. We're accountable for following best practices and achieving positive outcomes, and accountable for advancing equity, even when the root causes driving disparities feel out of our control. And finally, that we're inclusive, in the sense that system professionals recognize the strengths and critical importance of families and make them full partners in their children's cases, that we work with community partners to connect youth with a rich array of positive youth development opportunities, and we ensure that these family and community partnerships are robust for youth of all races and ethnicities. This is the JDAI that I envision.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Ohio's mission and vision as it relates to JDAI. And it's very simple. And it's really that we really want to be sure that all youth are treated equitably and they have all the things that they need to be successful. And we do that through community reinvestment programs and transformational opportunities. So within our department, at the Department of Youth Services, in our Bureau of Community Reinvestment, we allocate upwards of $60 million statewide to juvenile courts, all of the 88 juvenile courts within the state of Ohio, so that they can implement programs and services that keep kids in their communities and away from secure detention. And it's really to connect those kids to community resources and community programs that not only continue to promote public safety and victim restoration, but also really allowing the kids to develop into their full potential, because all kids, regardless of race, regardless of economic status, regardless of anything or other factors in their lives, they have the opportunity to be the most successful. And within this work here in Ohio, we rely heavily on community partnerships and collaboration, as Cecilia stated earlier, to do this work, because true system reform means relying and collaborating and trusting community as experts in our reform work. Because again, kids live within your community. You know your community and the kids in your community way better than other folks. So within our mission, we really heavily stress the value and the input and the expertise of community partners. And so we just wanted to throw out a little timeline of JDAI and kind of give you guys a quick overview of what counties are actually involved in the initiative. So we currently have 19 sites within the state of Ohio, or 19 juvenile courts or counties who are currently participating in the initiative. Just a quick chat question. Do you see your county represented in this group of 19 counties who are currently implementing those strategies around reform? I'll check the chat really quickly just to see. Yep, we see Franklin County. Anyone else see their county within this cohort? Summit County. We see your hometown, Clark. Yep, Clark County is involved. Montgomery. Awesome. So since 2009, you can continue to put that in the chat, but since 2009, 2010, Ohio has made that commitment to really work towards reforming our system. And it started out with 5 of our big 6 counties, so Cuyahoga, Franklin, Lucas, Montgomery, and Summit. Hamilton, which is our 6th largest or our next largest big county that joined the initiative, they joined around 2019, 2020. But you can also see that there are several other smaller counties who have made the commitment and worked really hard to transform and are continuing to do so, transforming their system for kids. Now, like Cecilia stated earlier, our JDAI work, or the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative work, has really evolved over the years since its inception over 30 years ago. And it really has focused and transformed to not only just work through reforming the front end of our system and looking at detention admissions, but really looking to expand further into the deep end of our system, because we quickly realized that any type of out-of-home placement, especially residential placements or other congregate care facilities, and even more so state-run institutions or community correctional facilities. Really, anytime you place a kid out of their home, you create that risk of causing more harm than good. So we quickly realized that we needed to kind of transform the way we do our work to focus on all areas of the justice system, even more so in the deep end of our work. So earlier on, the Annie E. Casey Foundation really expanded the JDAI work to include what we consider the deep end, that's really working to reduce all types of out-of-home placement for youth. And again, more specifically for youth of color, because when we think about the representation of who's in our system, it is very evident in our data that youth of color, again, specifically Black boys, are vastly overrepresented in every area of our system. And the deeper that we go into our system, that disparity and disproportionality is even greater. So we really wanted to transform all areas of our system. And so when we were looking at our deep end work and thinking about how do we transform all out-of-home placements deeper into the system, we realized that there were 2 main doorways, or 2 immediate doorways towards out-of-home placement. One being judicial dispositions, and then the other being probation practice. And so as a state, we have really committed and worked with several of our counties and really across the state, honestly, to really rethink and transform probation to see, okay, how can we develop more appropriate practices for probation that keep kids in their communities and reduce that risk of out-of-home placement. So we launched something, or the Annie E. Casey Foundation launched this initiative or within JDAI called Probation Transformation, which is really reimagining the fundamentals of probation and moving towards a more developmentally appropriate approach that is more conducive to behavior change, something that is more strength-based, that promotes positive youth development and long-term success, doing away with what we would call supervision only probation, or what we jokingly call sidearm probation, and moving to a more coaching model, case management model that is designed to really fit and address the needs of kids in our communities. And so we have about 11 sites across the state who are participating in this probation transformation initiative. And the two key pillars of probation transformation that we've been working on with all of our sites is, number one, to reduce the number of youth on probation by placing more kids in the front end of the system, and diverting more, which really means relying more on community. And we'll get into that a little bit. And then for those kids who remain on probation, we reserve probation for those kids who are the highest risk, the highest needs, and we refashion probation in a way that is more strategic with effective interventions for those kids that we keep in some type of probation practice or probation program. And what was our rationale for change? Well, it was a couple things. Probation's footprint in the juvenile justice system. Probation is actually one of the most, if not the most used dispositions for all justice practice, not just juveniles, but also in the adult system, is one of the most commonly used dispositions. And so we knew, especially here in Ohio, when it came to how we were allocating and distributing dollars and what counties and sites were using their dollars for, a great portion of that was for probation services. So we wanted to shrink probation's footprint in the system, and again, push kids and keep kids in their communities in the front end of the system, where they do much better at than in the deep end of the system. Again, we really wanted to make that emphasis to change probation practices because of the racial and ethnic disparities. Again, youth of color. I will continue to be more specific, saying that youth of color, particularly Black boys, and I'm sure you probably can see and maybe some of the work that you all do, especially within reentry, when it came to like out-of-home placements and such, youth of color, particularly Black boys, are vastly overrepresented and make up the greater share of those kids that are in the deeper end of the system. And again, probation really became kind of like a gateway to incarceration. How so? Mostly because of how prior probation or more traditional probation practices kind of create this pathway towards probation violations. And then usually what happens when a kid gets some type of probation violation, well, they pose a greater risk of being removed from their home and being either placed in detention or placed in some type of congregate care facility, or placed maybe in a state-run institution. And we really wanted to transition and move our prior practices of probation because it really wasn't aligned with what works best for youth. Again, you probably have heard in a lot of your work and your connection to this field that youth really do not develop or have their brains fully developed, honestly, until the age of 26. So, we really wanted to create a program and create services that are aligned with a youth's growing brain, and that is aligned with really works best towards positive behavior change. So we just wanted to throw this slide up around the juvenile justice continuum to kind of give you an idea of kind of how we see a lot of our work. And again, we want to push a greater share. You can kind of see towards the far left of the screen, we want to push a greater share of the work that we do with kids when it's appropriate in that diversionary and early intervention phase or of the continuum. And again, we want to rely really heavily and make that connection for kids to their community, because communities are really experts in a lot of this work. So what do we consider diversion? Well, diversion is really any type of redirection of youth from the formal court process or the formal juvenile court process. And within Ohio, we've attempted to do tons of different strategies, and we'll talk about one of them in just a moment. But I wanted to kind of paint the picture of what diversion could look like for us. And what really we are advocating for when we're working with jurisdictions around the state when it comes to pushing kids further in the system to get them connected. And so we listed out a few opportunities for diversion. And I think traditionally, when community hears about diversion, we think about, okay, just a court-run diversion program, which that is typically appropriate, and there's no issues with that as so long as a kid doesn't see a judge or magistrate and they're kept away from the formal court process. But we wanted to offer the idea that diversionary services can happen way beyond just a court-run diversion program. So diversion programs can be held in the community. We have sites who are working with community partners, community leaders to actually do that diversion program or do that diversion service. We also think about diversion maybe within police diversion and police deflection. And there are tons of opportunities. We have courts who are currently working with police and law enforcement agencies to actually divert kids and do some work with those kids in lieu of placing them or sending them into a formal court process. School diversion, we have some schools or some courts who are collaborating with their schools to really do some diversion programs. So in instances where they may have referred a kid to the juvenile court, they are working with schools or doing some type of wraparound service or intervention with the kid and their family, and keeping them, again, away from any type of formal court process. And then one of the interventions or programs and services that we've really been pushing with our not only our JDAI sites, but our sites around the state is through the use of reception and assessment centers. Just a quick chat question. Has anyone heard of a reception or an assessment center or knows of the assessment or reception center in their community? I see one yes, I see a no, a couple no's. Okay. I will put this up. Okay, so assessment and resource centers are really intended to, number one, divert youth away from further involvement in the juvenile justice system or the child welfare systems through a single point of contact. And it's primarily used as a hub for kids and families to get access to screenings and assessments, and then linkage to community-based resources and other pro-social activities. So we've been working with courts and sites around the state to consider developing these assessment centers for several purposes. One, when a law enforcement makes contact with the youth, in lieu of sending them to detention for whatever offense, they can refer them to their assessment or resource center. And then two, for families and youth and families who are just in need of basic services or things to address their basic needs or their fundamental needs, they can go straight to these community-based centers to get access to those services or linkage to those services, because we really firmly believe that a kid and family should not have to be criminalized in order to get access to the things that they need. In Ohio, we have an assessment center work group as part of our JDAI work, who works closely together to learn from each other to develop and structure community-based assessment and resource centers. And I'm going to put up on the screen just a quick map of what that looks like. So currently in the state of Ohio, we have 21 assessment and resource centers. Does anyone see an assessment or resource center within their county? I'll quickly look at the chat if anyone wants to share what county that they see their assessment or resource center. Ones labeled in blue are the ones that are currently being developed. So within our bureau, we allocated or we distributed dollars to juvenile courts through a competitive process for assessment and resource centers. And we recently awarded three other counties to begin developing these assessment or resource centers. And so those are the ones that are in blue that you see. Oh yeah, I see there's a need for that in Portage County. Right. It's awesome. I don't know, is anyone from Hancock County on the call? Hancock County has a family resource center that is not connected to the juvenile justice system in any way, but it's an awesome model because it's designed to be this hub where families can get access to just the basic services that they need, like utility support or parental support, transportation service, basic medical care. And really, that is our vision for juvenile reform, juvenile justice reform, and really justice reform as a whole. And again, it relies heavily on that community connection and involvement with community and really leaning to community as experts in the field and in this work. So again, I can't stress it enough. We're going to talk about it, throughout this presentation. And if you see us present again, we'll be sharing more about that. But again, our justice reform work cannot be siloed with just those juvenile justice professionals. If we're going to do true system reform, it has to rely heavily on community. And community does not just extend to those larger corporations or organizations, but it also extends to those grassroots organizations, those mom and pop shops, those credible messengers or individuals who really have a connection to the community where kids reside in. So we really have been working with jurisdictions to develop some type of programs or services that lean heavily on community partnership. And more recently, we have allocated dollars to juvenile courts so that they can reinvest those dollars into community to create restorative justice practices. Is anyone on the call familiar with restorative justice or has heard of restorative justice practices? Okay, not yet in Franklin. So restorative justice practices really take a holistic approach that focuses on repairing harm caused to victims or communities and allowing youth to really take full ownership and accountability in their actions in which they cause that harm. And then it's done so through various methods, either through peace circles or victim mediation, victim impact panels, or family conferencing and the like. Because the traditional juvenile justice framework or model and how we kind of do juvenile justice really is heavily based on punishment and just punishing the person, punishing the youth that caused that harm, but not really focusing on allowing that youth to give back to the community. It's sit down with community and have that opportunity to repair that harm. Because ultimately, in the end goal, we want kids, especially, to have an opportunity to develop into successful adults so that they can contribute back to your neighborhoods and back to where they came from. And so we have sites who are collaborating with community-based organizations to do some restorative justice practices on all areas within the continuum of the justice system, not just within diversion. We've seen success or have heard of success with restorative justice practices working really well, especially with more serious crimes. And again, restorative justice practices, I will want to say that it does not necessarily eliminate the need for traditional justice practices or justice procedures, because at times that is necessary, but we really want to focus on community wellness and making victims whole, making families whole, making communities whole. So we are allocating dollars and have allocated dollars for courts to really give back and reinvest to create that. Has anyone ever heard of credible messengers or has any idea what credible messengers are? So credible messengers are community leaders or folks with lived experience in the justice system who can then give back and mentor to youth and families. They also are used nationwide, especially as violence interrupters. So credible messengers, typically what we consider are folks who probably have had some experience within the system that can then mentor other folks to kind of share their experiences and help them navigate the system and steer away from further involvement in the system. But credible messengers do not have to only be those folks with lived system experience directly. It can be also folks who maybe have had indirect experience within the system. For example, like a grandparent or a mother whose child went through the system. They can then be a credible messenger and do some peer advocacy or mentoring with another grandmother or mother who is currently going through the system. Or it can just be an individual community leader who maybe has not had any direct involvement in the system, but is very familiar with their community and knows really deeply the culture of the community that can then connect, work with youth and families. So let's get into really quickly, as we kind of get to the closeout, just some of the data and the outcomes related to the work that we've done around JDAI and our other reform strategies. So we collect data annually for all of our JDAI sites so that we can kind of get an idea of what's happening. Again, like Cecilia shared earlier, data being one of the core strategies that we operate within the JDAI initiative is so important because it tells a story of what we're doing, what we need to improve on, and it really highlights the success that we had. So as you can see, here we have a slide that just includes our big 6 counties. So we wanted to separate that because historically and even currently, our big 6 counties commit or admit the most kids traditionally to detention centers. And so you can see from their baseline year, which is the dark blue, the baseline year is the year that they started implementing or started or made the commitment to reform their system through JDAI. From that year to calendar year 2023, each of those sites have seen a pretty significant reduction in their detention admissions without compromising community safety. Which has been pretty awesome. They've seen about a 66% reduction. We also shared the data for our remaining 13 counties who have also seen a great reduction, about 52% or so reduction in their detention admissions. And like we said earlier, we have a focus within our JDAI work to go beyond just detention admissions. And so we wanted to share a little bit of our data on the reduction of out-of-home placements, because that's also been a significant change in the best way for our counties. So you can see here, big 6 counties from their baseline year to calendar year 2023 have seen a significant reduction, as well as all of the other remaining 13 or the expansion sites have seen a significant reduction. UIS commitments, so those are commitments to our state-run facilities and to our departments from their baseline year through calendar years 2021, 22, and 23 have seen a significant reduction in their commitments to our department. So fewer kids are being placed out of the home and into away from maximum security facilities. And you'll see right here that there is a slight uptick that's trending, but we kind of account for the year 2021 and 2020 being that year that our world changed through the pandemic, and overall referrals and filings to courts and such declined very significantly during that time. But still, even with the slight uptick, we've seen a significant reduction from our big 6 counties. I do want to highlight again that while we have seen that significant reduction in our detention admissions and seen a significant reduction in our out-of-home placements and commitments to state-run facilities, we have actually seen kind of our disparities widen. Black youth continue to make up the greater share of detention admissions at a very alarming rate. And so we cannot negate that when we're talking about reform work, we're really talking about making our system better for all kids, but particularly our Black boys in our communities. Again, we just wanted to highlight really quickly just commitments by race. again, from that baseline year, again, I showed the slide a few moments ago that we have made significant reductions to our DYS commitment from the baseline year to the current fiscal year. But you'll notice here that for calendar year 2023, while we have made significant reductions overall to our commitments, we've actually widened our that gap between youth of color and white youth has actually increased significantly. And so we're at 88% of all of our commitments to our department, and it could be slightly higher this calendar year, being that of youth of color. And again, it is vastly overrepresented by Black boys. We wanted to throw a little bit about the success of probation programs who are really working towards transforming around the state their probation practices. Those courts, all sites who are funding probation and really implementing transformative practices have seen a successful termination rate of 83% and an outcome achievement rate of over 73%. And that really means some type of recidivism measure that all of them are tracking 1 year post completion. So we wanted to see, like, after a year has passed since you've completed the program, are they coming back into our system? And 73% have seen a successful outcome achievement rate. Same thing for diversion programs. Again, kids do way better in the front end. They're seeing over an 84% successful termination rate, and then an 84% outcome achievement rate. So meaning that when a kid is placed on a diversionary status and kept on the front end, they have a greater likelihood of not returning back into the justice system, what again is just better for all of us, and especially in the community. So that's all we have today. Are there any questions that we can answer?
Brittany, there was one in the chat there at the tail end. What is the process for partnering with DYS and creating more restorative justice initiatives in the local communities?
Absolutely. So that's kind of twofold. So if there are restorative practices that you want to work with within the state facilities, we can definitely connect personally for that. In terms of more local initiatives, again, our agency distributes the dollars to each of the 88 juvenile courts. So if that's something that you're interested in, I can connect you directly to the juvenile courts to kind of propose some type of restorative justice practice that could potentially be funded in that manner in that local jurisdiction. Again, Cecilia and I just represent the state in the state agency, but we can certainly connect you directly to community partners or to the local juvenile courts who really have the dollars and the funding to support restorative practices in the community. Oh, okay. Are there funding opportunities from JDAI open and known to the public? No. So the JDAI, well, okay, I'll say this. Within our agency, we don't have any dollars that we allocate directly to the public. Now, the Anna E. Casey Foundation, which is the national initiative that houses JDAI across all jurisdictions throughout the country, they have grant and funding opportunities. But local, a lot of that is, I guess, can be given directly to community-based organizations and maybe in partnership with juvenile courts in that local court jurisdiction. Has there been consideration about working with FCFC? Yeah, so I think a lot of courts have started that, and really, especially with the consideration of advancing and moving forward the assessment and resource centers. So absolutely, if there's something specific within your county that I can help with, you know, I can definitely connect you to that person. Maybe I should put up the screen with our contact information really quickly. You guys can take a quick snapshot of that.
There's also some counties too who partner with their FCFC and who are also part of their like JDAI executive committees within their counties as well. So there are definitely counties who partner with their FCFC.
Absolutely. JDAI have a position on the new Medicaid inmate exclusion changes. So I can't speak to that, but Megan, if you want to just like send me a quick email, then we can chat a little bit about that.
All right, we have just a minute or two left. If there's any last minute questions, we want to make sure we give everybody ample time to take a short lunch break, and the next workshop will be starting at 12:15. All right, it looks like our questions have completed. Thank you so much, Brittany and Cecilia for a wonderful presentation. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much. It was really helpful.